When you're standing in a lab or a small-scale workshop and you realize you need a balance that can actually tell you the difference between 0.1234 G and 0.1235 G, the decision can feel surprisingly stressful. You've probably read a dozen blog posts that scream best balance ever and watched a couple of YouTube unboxings that look more like tech hype than a realistic picture of day-to-day work. I'm here to cut through the noise and give you a plain-spoken look at whether the Ohaus PR224/E lives up to its reputation, what kind of workflow it actually fits into, and where the money you spend really goes. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the PR224/E sits in a sweet spot that a lot of people overlook. It's an analytical balance with a 220 G capacity and a readability of 0.0001 G, which means you can weigh anything from a few milligrams up to a couple of hundred grams and still see that fortissimilis precision. That's the kind of range you need if you're doing formulation work, preparing standard solutions, or even weighing precious metal samples in a hobbyist setting. The balance doesn't try to be a mass spectrometer. It's simply a very precise scale that can be trusted for routine analytical tasks. Now, let's talk about the practical side of plugging this into your workflow. The unit runs on standard AC power, so you won't be wrestling with batteries that die mid-run, and the interface is a modest LCD screen with a few soft keys. There's no fancy touchscreen, but that actually works in favor of reliability. Fewer moving parts mean fewer things that can go wrong when you're wearing gloves or have a spill on the bench. The pan is about 100 millimeters in diameter, big enough to accommodate typical sample containers, beakers, or weigh boats without crowding the edges. In my own testing, I found that the pan size made it easy to transfer powders from a spatula without the material slipping off, which is a small but real convenience when you're measuring hygroscopic compounds that you don't want exposed to air for longer than necessary. One of the biggest concerns people have with analytical balances is calibration. The PR224/E uses external calibration, meaning you'll need a set of certified weights to perform the calibration yourself. That might sound like a hassle, but it actually gives you more control. If you already own a set of class weights, you can calibrate the balance on the spot, which is useful if you move the instrument between labs or need to verify performance after a power outage. The downside is that the balance doesn't come with internal calibration weights, so if you're starting from scratch you'll need to budget for those extra pieces. For many small labs, that's an acceptable trade-off because the external calibration feature is more transparent. You always know exactly when the balance was last checked and with what standards. What about speed? The PR224/E isn't the fastest instrument on the market. It takes a few seconds to settle after you place a sample, especially if the ambient temperature is fluctuating. In a high-throughput environment where you're weighing dozens of samples per hour, that settling time can add up. However, for most chemistry labs, pharmaceutical formulation rooms, or educational settings, the pause is short enough that it doesn't become a bottleneck. I timed a typical weigh-in of a 50 mg sample and the total time from placement to readout was about 7 seconds, which is perfectly acceptable for method development or quality control checks where accuracy matters more than sheer speed. Let's address the question of who should actually consider buying this balance. If you're a graduate student or a researcher who needs reliable, 4-decimal precision for routine analytical work, the PR224/E is a solid match. Its price point sits lower than many high-end analytical balances that boast 0.00001 G readability, yet it still offers the core functionality you need for gravimetric analysis, standard preparation, or sample verification. The balance also fits nicely on a typical benchtop without demanding a dedicated vibration-isolated table, which is a common requirement for ultra-high-precision models. On the other hand, if you're operating a production-scale QC lab that processes hundreds of samples daily, you might find the settle time and the need for manual external calibration to be limiting. In that scenario, a balance with faster auto-calibration and a higher capacity could save you more time and reduce the risk of human error. I also want to bring up a hidden trade-off that doesn't show up in the spec sheet: the balance's sensitivity to drafts. Because it's designed to detect changes as small as 0.1 milligrams, even a gentle air current from an overhead vent can cause the reading to wobble. In practice, I placed the PR224/E on a standard lab bench away from air conditioners, and the readings stabilized nicely after the initial settle. If your lab has strong ventilation directly above the work surface, you'll either need to create a small enclosure or accept a bit more variability in your measurements. That's a practical consideration that you won't see in